Hi, I'm Goose, and welcome back to Design in Minecraft. Today, we're going to be talking about composition. So what exactly is composition? Well, composition is the balancing of principles and elements within a project. When I say principles and elements, I mean things like color and emphasis and scale and movement, all the things that we've talked about in this series and in the color theory series. We have all of these different tools to describe our work. The way that we choose to use these things is composition. Now, we can describe the composition of anything, even if it's not intentional. You didn't create the mountains, but you can still look at them and describe what you see using the principles of composition. What we're doing is we're learning how to identify and manipulate these principles so that we can create a composition that is accurate to what we are imagining in our mind. Like I said before, what we are doing is learning and practicing tools that help us describe and articulate the choices that we make. Now, we're going to cover two kinds of composition today. We're going to focus primarily on perceptual composition, and then we're going to touch a little bit on narrative composition at the end. Perceptual composition is what you see. It's the visual aspect of composition, how things are placed and how we move around the scene with our eyes and with our body. I've broken perceptual composition into a few key points: focus, framing, and paths. We talked about focus when we discussed balance and emphasis, but I want to go over some more examples of how we can control focus when dealing with all the different principles at once. These are very simple exercises to show you more of what I mean. Different elements of design have different weights. Our first example here uses scale to control the balance. It's pretty straightforward how we can change the balance by changing the size. We go over here and remove some blocks. That's more balanced. But we can also put those back and add more over here. Now, things don't have to be the exact same to be balanced, but this is just a general example of using size to create balance. But what about this one? Color has a tremendous amount of weight in a composition. Contrasting colors is one of the most common ways to create emphasis. So how do we use some of the other elements to balance this out? In this case, I'm going to use scale and movement. Now, if we just use scale and we increase the scale over here, we're just adding more stone. Now, this kind of works, but I could also argue that this actually increases the focus on the green block. Before, it was just a green block and some stone, but now we have one that is dramatically different than all the ones over here. I think the more that we add, the more this will actually stand out. So let's take advantage of the eye being pulled towards the green block instead of fighting against it by making kind of an arch out of the stone that points to it. So if when we look at this, the eye immediately goes this way, you may as well emphasize that with something else that draws the eye this way. Now this creates kind of a circular path for the eye to follow around, and the eye wants to keep going back to follow it back around to the green. It's a very simple example, but it shows the principle pretty well. When we're dealing with a little more complex example, we have more ways that we can choose from to examine and change the composition. More focus is put on the door. The color stands out, there's more depth, there's more contrast, there's different textures, and that could be exactly what you want. Maybe you want the focus to stay on the door and keep that as the focal point, but maybe you don't. So what are some ways that we can balance this out and make this a little bit more even on both sides? Well, there's a lot of things we could do. To start, we could maybe bring the mangrove wood over. We could put a window in to draw the eye over a little. Or maybe we'll just increase the complexity of the design in order to create a little more interest. These are all different ways that you can increase the weight over here and make this a little more cohesive. Personally, I like to keep the focus on the door because that's where people are going to be going and entering. Knowing where to put things can be just as tricky as knowing what to put there. This is called framing or staging a scene. There are tons of different ways to frame a scene, but we're going to go over just a couple common techniques that you're going to see a lot. First up is the rule of thirds. When we cut a frame into thirds, vertically and horizontally, we end up with these lines and these intersections. Placing points of interest along these lines and then focal points on the intersections tends to work very well. Now, I'm not sure if there's something inherent about these points and about this layout that we're drawn to, or if we just see it so much that we're accustomed to understand it as good composition, but you will see this everywhere once you know what you're looking for. Now, the size of the frame doesn't matter. As long as you're dividing it up into equal thirds, the same thing applies. Now, next up is symmetry. This creates a very balanced, focused frame. Like I said before, this is great when you're building things like shrines, monuments, capitals, things like that. It gives off a sense of importance and correctness that fits well with those. You may notice that making these asymmetrical, like moving the line too far to the left or right or up and down, is going to place things in the intersections of the rule of thirds. Now, here we have diagonals. Diagonals are great for moving the eyes around a composition. They create a lot of movement, and just like the rule of thirds, using things along the lines and then putting focal points at the intersections works really nicely. Perspective lines are diagonal as well, and it pulls the eye in or up and away depending on how you use them. For example, if you have a focal point in the center, using things like roofs or cliff walls to frame that in along these diagonals will help pull the eye into the center. And over here, we have what a lot of people refer to as the golden ratio or the golden rule or the Fibonacci ratio. These are all good names for it. All this is creating a spiral based off the Fibonacci sequence and then placing points of interest or compositional elements along that line. This is very common. People like it because the Fibonacci sequence is very interesting. Spirals are awesome, so that's really cool. But I don't think that this is inherently a good way to compose a scene. And in my opinion, it's kind of a gimmick because people tend to use it and think that that makes their composition good instead of making a good composition and then adjusting it to fit within these parameters. Still a cool trick though. Now, you might be thinking, Goose, this is all great, but this is Minecraft. Things aren't flat and stationary. Things are 3D and we can move around. And to that, I say, there are two kinds of paths that we're going to cover. Paths that show movement around a scene, and the paths that show movement through a scene. I covered both of these when talking about perceptual movement in the line and movement section, but I'll give a quick recap. Movement around a scene is still in the realm of 2D. This is a path that your eye follows when you look at something. Maybe up the path into the house, or maybe it starts at the house and then is drawn down here. Movement through a scene is when we dive into the realm of 3D. This is the path that an environment encourages you to take when you're moving around. Now, I want to address something. When I spoke about this before in the movement and line episode, a lot of you commented things like, you should just go this way because there's loot off the intended path, or I would just go straight over the hill, not around it. These are all completely valid, and I also do the same thing. Who else completely missed the first guide stones when they played through Skyrim for the first time because they immediately went off the path? But you might be missing out on some really cool shots and scenes that an environment artist spent a lot of time on. I need to make a quick shout out to the team that made one of my all-time favorite games, Journey. It is an absolutely masterful execution of perceptual movement and composition in general. If you are at all interested in the stuff that I talk about and you haven't played through Journey, I would say that it is essential material to experience and study. Now, I have a small scale example here that we're going to dissect a little bit and discuss the composition. Because you can't really make sure that every angle is well composed, it can be useful to pick 2 or 3 and make them into a kind of keyframe, point of interest where you can really dial in on the composition. This will create a well-composed scene from multiple angles, and it'll help it feel consistent while you're moving through it. Now, the 2 keyframes I have right here is that green block and this red one right here. So let's talk about the composition. Over here, we have a pretty heavily weighted area. There's a lot of buildings, there's a mountain behind it, there's a lot more texture, there's more interest going on here. Now, if we just had that and the bridge and then this tower, it would feel weighted to the right side. I also wanted to create more depth and a little bit more scale, so I put this building right here. It's large, it's in the foreground, and it's also blocking out this whole section. This is going to put a lot of weight on the left side, and it's going to balance it out. In terms of the focal point, I would say the bridge is probably the main focal point because A, it's in the center, it's at a horizon line, and it's a different color. This is going to pull the eye left and right, and it's going to encourage the eye to look back and forth and around this to examine the entire picture instead of just one spot. Now, if we go over to the other keyframe, we have a much different composition. It's a little more symmetrical, with the river going straight down the middle and the bridge over top. And because we have so many buildings leading up this way, it creates a lot of depth and movement of the eye up into that area. Then we use the color of the trees and this little building over here to help balance it on the right. Now those are the paths around the image, but what about the paths through the image? Actual paths are a great way to deal with this. As we move around, this moves in a good kind of circular motion. In this case, we'd be going through that building. and over into this point that I would say is the main focus. There's the most going on, there's a lot of detail you can add, and you get a pretty good view of everything from this point. On my last video about scale, someone pointed out something very interesting that they wanted to hear about, and this is what's called forced perspective. Forced perspective is when you vary things, especially the scale, to make things look bigger or smaller than they actually are, because, like almost all the other elements, scale is relative. So something will appear bigger when it's surrounded by other things that look smaller. A great example here is just using the azalea bushes in place of trees. They make it feel just a little bit more like this is a scaled miniature rather than just a few blocks stacked up on each other. I wanted to look into this more, so I made another example focusing on forced perspective. Now here we have 4 stages of distance. We have the foreground that's the closest, we have one that's a little farther, then we have some stuff in the background, and then we have the far background over here. Now this is only 30 or so blocks across, but by using different sizes and different blocks, we can make it look like it goes down into a large valley, even though it's really close. Doing things like making trees out of fences and leaves that are a lot smaller are great for this. The azalea bushes are great, and finding tricky ways to kind of mimic the color and texture of a house like this can be really useful as well. In the back, we don't need as much detail, so just a little touch of mangrove does the trick. The farther away something gets, the less detail we're going to be able to see on it. So if we mimic that by making it smaller and putting less detail, it can trick the mind into thinking that it's farther away. Over here, I built the same entryway in a bunch of different scales as if they were getting farther away. Now here's the main entryway. This is how we would build it if we were up close. But let's say we want to make it look like it's farther away. The farther away we go, the less detail we add, until at the end, it has the same general impact as this, but when we really get up to it, it's only a couple blocks high, and there's not really much detail at all. This can be great for doing things like building a small village on the side of a mountain up behind a main build. It'll make the mountain look a lot bigger and farther away, and it can also make building things easier knowing that if they're viewed from far away, you really don't have to put as much detail into them. Now, of course, this falls apart if it's a situation where someone can go over here and walk up to it, but when you're dealing with keyframe compositions, or you're just making a scene, or you want to add some detail in the distance, this can be very, very useful. Now, that covers most of the basics of perceptual composition. There's a lot more. This is just touching on the basics, so please look into it more, ask questions. There's a lot of other stuff we can talk about. But when it really comes down to it, it's taking all of these elements that we've talked about and finding ways to place and arrange and utilize them to make a build or a scene or a setting or an environment more interesting or more in line with the image that we had in our head. I know I run into this a lot where I have an image in my head, and the second I start building it, it kind of starts changing and fading away in my mind. This can be very frustrating, but the more that we practice these tools, the better we will get at pulling what we have in our mind out and putting it in front of us. We can think of it literally as a big block of marble, and all of the tools that we talk about are the tools and the chisels that we will use to carve out the thing that we want to see. But there is more to it. And one of those things that we're going to touch on is called narrative composition. Now, we're going to touch really briefly on this because this could be an entire channel talking about how to compose a narrative and how to use that to influence your builds. So we're just going to talk about some basic properties of it. The first point that I want to make about narrative composition is that things have a much different weight when they're viewed in context. Even though I made this completely plain and we have a lot more detail and contrast here, there is one block that I can add that will change all of that. That's all it takes. Now, that is red, and so there's a lot of visual contrast there, but we also know in context that TNT is going to blow up. Especially in Minecraft, the TNT block holds a ton of weight because of the narrative context of us knowing that it's explosive. But there's something we can do that'll make it even more. Just put a pressure plate next to it, and we can increase it even more by putting a chicken there. I bet your eye's not going to leave that for very long. Are you going to do it? What if we add some more? It increases the tension because we know of the inherent consequences of having that situation there. That's a great example of narrative composition. Narrative composition is essential when you're world building. We have to use visual cues to show people what the building is about. Now here we have just a general building, But if we move over here a little bit, we see some hay bales and some targets. That just screams archery range right there. And then if we continue inside, we can see things like the bows on the wall. We have some feathers and strings, sticks on the ground for making arrows. All of these things are little visual cues that are going to help explain what the build is about and what's happening in the world. Those are the basics of what narrative composition means when you look at it visually. Block palette can have a big impact as well, using things like cracked stone bricks instead of new stone bricks, or using mossy cobble instead of normal cobble, all have an impact on the narrative feel and the narrative composition of a build. Using more iron blocks and concrete and glass might make something look more modern, and then decorating it with certain things can change the way that someone views a build. Giving little narrative hints can really enhance the way that a build feels and the immersion associated with it. Composition is very subjective. And like I've said before, these tools are not here to make something better in one way or another. These tools are here so that you can learn how to use them to better articulate the image that you have in your mind and bring it forward into real life. This series has been a ton of fun to make. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. I really, really am grateful for all the support that you guys have given me. I am blown away by how much feedback and appreciation and people have joined the Discord and the comments that I'm getting. You guys are awesome. I really, really love it. And I cannot thank you enough for all of this. So thank you again. And an extra shout out to the people that are in the Discord. You guys have been amazing. It is an amazing community. There's like 500 something members in there, and we don't even have a moderator because honestly, we haven't needed it. I'm sure that's going to change. Maybe that's going to change after I post this video and say that, but it's just an awesome community. So thank you, all of you guys in there specifically. I will be back sometime soon with some more videos. I'm thinking I might move into some terraforming stuff. I want to focus a little bit more on showcasing builds rather than just talking about the principles and giving lessons. I have another cool little secret project coming up that is going to be soon. I don't know when, but it's going to be soon. So subscribe, leave a like and comment, all that stuff. You guys are already doing that. You're doing great at it. And I will see you guys next time, whenever that is. See ya.